This week on Frontiers, we look back on the November 30th earthquake. And joining us now for a more in-depth discussion on this, Rob Witter, a research geologist with the U.S. Geological Survey. And we also have John Thornley, who is a geotechnical engineer who serves as a consultant for the city on an advisory board. And so, we had so much information from this earthquake. I mean, and when you talk to people about all their different experiences, they vary so much. I mean, it's massive. But maybe, Rob, you could start to talk about what you focus on to help us get ready for the next one.
Well, I like to focus on talking to the community and helping people understand where these earthquakes come from. Why do we have earthquakes in Alaska, and the different types of shaking that people experience.
So, and you, John, in advising this board as a consultant, what are the things that you try to bring into the mix?
As a geotechnical engineer with the Advisory Commission, the Geotechnical Advisory Commission, our goal is to help plan a safer community. And so through the development of additional code and planning and zoning efforts, we work to make Anchorage a safer place to live.
Well, it seems that everybody that you talk to, everybody has a different experience, but the thread that comes through this is, thank God for the tougher building codes after the '64 quake. That seems to be the big lesson.
Especially 64 was kind of a watershed moment in code development, and then also the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake and the 1994 Northridge earthquake, both in California, helped really drive the research for safer buildings, and you see a significant growth in the seismic code development as a result of those two earthquakes especially.
So they say that the '64 earthquake changed the way that we understood earthquakes. Do you think that this earthquake, the November 30th, 2018 quake, will broaden our understanding as well?
I think it helps us understand how deep earthquakes like this one was. It occurred 34 miles below our feet. What type of shaking to expect for those earthquakes, and where to expect them in the future.
So how was this earthquake different from the '64 quake?
Well, we live on a very active boundary between two tectonic plates that are moving toward each other. They're converging and crashing together, and they form a deep trench offshore in the Gulf of Alaska. We have the Pacific plate offshore, and it's moving at about a rate of 2.5 inches per year towards Alaska. But because the ocean plate's really dense, it sinks below Alaska, but it gets stuck. And it's the friction between these two plates where they got stuck together that broke apart in 1964, and it ruptured an area that was 500 miles long by 150 miles wide, producing huge deformations all over south central Alaska. But by comparison, in 2018, it was this Pacific slab that's subducting beneath Alaska that just cracked at 34 miles deep. The area of the fault that broke was about the area of downtown Anchorage.
So it wasn't a big area compared to 500 miles.
Compared to 1964, it was much smaller. The magnitude was 7.1 last year compared to a magnitude 9.2 in 1964.
So if we're talking about the kind of shaking that people experienced in '64, how long did it last?
Yeah, the shaking in 1964 lasted for 4 to 5 minutes, and it caused long rolling motions that people experienced, and it lasted so long that it caused large areas of the land in Anchorage to slide away. Areas like the earthquake park today was a giant landslide in 1964 that actually started moving a couple minutes after the shaking began. Whereas in 2018, the shaking, depending on where you were, lasted between maybe 20 to 40 seconds, which was too short to reactivate these.
Boy, it sure felt longer than 40 seconds to me.
Yeah, it does.
But why did it vary?
Well, it's just to rupture tectonic plates over 500 miles takes much longer than to rupture a little thumbprint at 34 miles below our feet. So the depth of that earthquake in 2018 was really good because there's a lot of rock on top of that that dampened the shaking and reduced the impacts to Anchorage and the community around us.
You've been giving a lot of talks to the community about what happened on November 30th, 2018. And one of the things you said, and it just kind of grabbed my attention, is you said, think of the 64 quake as a polar bear,
right,
and think of what happened on November 30th as a ptarmigan.
Yeah. Well, so what I was trying to do there is, it's really difficult to get your head around how enormous these earthquakes are and the processes that cause them. And the moment magnitude scale, which we use to measure earthquake size, is logarithmic. That means every time you go up from a 7 to an 8 to a 9, you increase in the size of that earthquake by a factor of 10. So the magnitude 9.2 64 earthquake was 1,000 times larger than the earthquake we felt on November 30th last year. 1,000 times.
Oh my goodness.
So these are really two different animals in my mind.
So in getting ready for the
polar bear is 1,000 times the weight of our state bird, the willow ptarmigan.
Willow ptarmigan. Well, that's a very good way to think of it, but it does tell you that the potential for another big one, we didn't really have the big one per se.
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
So John, one of the things that people look at is the damage that we saw in Eagle River and Sand Lake, and some people just sort of assume that that was because it shook harder there.
And unfortunately, we have very few seismic monitoring stations outside of the Anchorage Bowl, and so in Anchorage we have a very good idea of how the shaking changed from location to location. But out in Eagle River, Chugiak area, we only have one station at the fire station in Chugiak. And so it's really difficult to make a strong statement that it shook stronger in Eagle River than it did in Anchorage. But there are a few effects, topographic effects and others that will actually amplify those ground motions a bit. And as you may be familiar, Eagle River is much more topographically differentiated than Anchorage. We're pretty level here. So there could be a little bit of that too.
Well, one of the things that we keep hearing is that building codes and their enforcement played a key role in the amount of damage in the Eagle River area. There are some that are outside this area. It's called the Anchorage Building Safety Area, where codes are enforced, and of course Eagle River, parts of it, aren't under that agreement. And so we have a graphic, first of all, to show people that area where codes are strictly enforced. And so what do we know from what happens inside that area and outside that area?
So one of the things that we know is when you're within the building safety service area, there's a code review process that includes what we would call the enforcement piece. And so if you were to pull a permit from the municipality, you would get a plan review, and your plans would be reviewed to make sure that you meet the building code. But then also during construction, you'll have visits by inspectors to verify the quality of the work and the fact that the work is built to the approved plan set.
So you see this poster that's out, and there's a second map that we'd like to show you, and this shows you kind of the actual damage inside and outside. And we see really bad damage, a cluster of it outside that area.
That's correct. And one of the things that structural engineers have made observations on is that a lot of the damage that has been seen in Eagle River has not necessarily been houses that were built to the code. An example is a siding that is only stapled onto the side of the walls rather than nailed. And that's an example of if you were building your house to the current code, you would have nails rather than staples. And so there have been a number of observations that have shown that there are some structures in Eagle River, and apparently potentially more structures in Eagle River than in Anchorage, that have not been built to the code.
And I have a friend who in Eagle River had one of the earliest homes kind of before codes, and of course it kind of slid on the foundation.
Okay.
So I guess these are things that I guess homeowners, when they buy things, don't always know about how strictly the code has been enforced in their building.
And I think we're a lot better educated on that now. I think there's a lot more awareness within the community when you're hiring a building inspector. If you're, say, buying a new house, you might look at it from a different lens than you would have a year ago before the earthquake.
Before we leave, I want to just show one graphic that we have. This came to us from the State Division of Emergency Management, and it looks at earthquakes around the world, big ones. And look at all the number of deaths that they have. You know, you see, and you know that those communities, you know, took maybe years to put back together again. But look at Anchorage, Alaska, in that 7.1 quake, 0 deaths.
Yeah, and I think you can attribute a lot of that one to the luck that we had with the depth of the earthquake. It was a lot deeper than the other events that you were showing there, and so we had that going for us. But we also had certainly a different building code than is typical in other countries, and so I think those two aspects together really helped, certainly saved lives.
Well, Rob Witter and John Thornley, I want to thank both of you for kind of giving us an overview as we look back on that quake 1 year ago. And of course, KTVA is going to have all kinds of coverage, and it's all different. I mean, so much information, so much to take in. It is a huge mosaic. Well, thanks again for joining us.